Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp Podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl. Thanks for joining, and if you're new here, welcome. For today's episode, I really hit the books, probably more than I have for any Girls Camp episode ever, because we are tackling a very rich, very interesting topic, which is the similarities between Severance and the world of Lumen, as portrayed in the TV series Severance, and Mormonism / high demand religions / cults, though we will be focusing mostly on Mormonism. If you haven't heard of Severance, it just ended its second season. It's an Apple TV Plus series, and it is really phenomenal. I feel like the whole internet is talking about Severance right now, and many of the people talking about Severance are noticing a lot of similarities with cults, high demand religions, and Mormonism. As an ex-Mormon watching this series, I loved it for so many reasons, but I do feel like the themes that it explores, as well as actually quite a few specific moments, really reminded me of what it was like to be Mormon, what it was like to deconstruct Mormonism. It was just very, very relevant, and I think that's the case for a lot of us. As I was researching for this episode, kind of pulling together these similarities, it just kept going. I just kept finding more and more thoughts and opinions and noticing certain things, and I just cannot wait to get into it with you. I'm going to start out by giving a brief description of Severance. I really don't think you need to have seen the show to enjoy this conversation because yes, we're talking about Severance, but more than the actual plot and characters, we're talking about what those plot points and what those characters reveal about things like high demand religions like Mormonism. As far as spoilers go, I'm going to try and keep it as light as possible. And if I am going to talk about a particular plot point, I will try and warn you so you can just skip ahead a couple minutes. This series is set at Lumen Industries, and Lumen is a company that created this procedure called Severance. It's basically an implant in the brain, and it separates your work memories from your personal memories, which creates two separate personas that they call an outie, that's the person in their regular life, and an innie, that's the person who goes to work. The innies have no memory of their life outside of work, so they basically wake up every day in the office, they work all day, and then they wake up the next day and do that again. It's basically one body, same body, but a severed, separate brain. The main character, our protagonist, is Mark Scout, who is played by Adam Scott. His outie opted into this procedure, Severance, because he experienced a very devastating situation in the outside world, and he works in the macro data refinement department. Mark and the rest of the innies that he works with begin to question their reality and the nature of their work at Lumen, which leads them on a journey to uncover the truth about the company and also about their own identities. We are going to first start by talking about this idea of severance more generally, this idea of really intense compartmentalization. And I pulled from a lot of sources with these thoughts. I had listeners submitted ideas and thoughts, which were phenomenal, really blew me away. So thank you for writing in your thoughts. I also did a lot of research on Reddit, on the ex-Mormon Reddit, and on the Apple TV Plus Severance Reddit. I'll link these all. There was also a lot of really good thoughts and opinions. So I will make sure to shout out wherever I'm getting information from if it was not from my own brain. And there will be some lovely work cited in the show notes if you want to peruse that after the episode. To kick off talking about how the idea of severance feels really applicable for ex-Mormons, this is from Chelsea Homer in an essay she wrote on Substack called Influencers in the Wild West. She actually, in this essay, was exploring a lot of what's going on with the response of active LDS influencers to the Ruby Franke documentary. But she has this little paragraph here about severance. She says, Mormonism breeds a severancing of sorts. In the same way we shelf and compartmentalize the confusing beliefs of Mormonism to make sense of the chaos, I believe our bodies are subjected to the same process. We hide, reject, and even pray away parts of ourselves in order to belong to such a homogenous, rule-abiding community. Through this LDS-coded lumen process, our self-awareness becomes deeply compromised. Insert the, quote, "I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon" t-shirts. I'm guessing that this is a familiar sentiment, but I feel like when I left Mormonism, and I'm still in this process after having left the church over 5 years ago now, I really feel like leaving the church feels like discovering who you really are. It kind of feels like meeting yourself for the first time because of what Chelsea said so beautifully. When you're Mormon, there is so much of yourself that you have to cut off. There are so many rules, whether those are actual doctrinal rules or cultural expectations, that really do force people, if you want to smoothly fit in at least, into a box. And so when leaving Mormonism and looking back, you see, oh, wow, there were these really big parts of myself, especially if you grew up, from day one, like I did. I was born into the church. There are parts of myself that I really never allowed myself to explore. And in that way, it feels truly like a severance. Like my Mormon self was one person and my ex-Mormon self is a completely different person. In Severance, the innies, so the ones who just exist at work, who are living in this very cult-like work environment at Lumen, that's the name of the company, they are very polite, very obedient, very obliging, I would say. And that starts to change over the course of the series as they start kind of pushing back and asking questions. But I feel like the innies really reminded me of my Mormon self. It's very, what's that phrase? Be sweet, pray, and obey. Do you know what I'm talking about? I think it was like the Duggars popularized this and their documentary was based on that phrase. But it's very much, don't rock the boat, be obedient, because if you step out of line, you're going to be in trouble. And I think that cultivates a certain kind of personality, especially when these innies only exist within that work environment. And so I feel like looking back on a Mormon self, you see yourself kind of taking on some of those traits that outside of that Mormon framework you wouldn't have otherwise. Like it has the power in some ways to even shape personality. Here's a listener submission. A lot of people I went to high school with had an innie who was the version at church and an outie, which was how they behaved every other day. They seemed to not know each other either. Yes, I absolutely can relate to that in high school, but also in adulthood, where I think there are a lot of active members who are one person at church and another person outside of church. And that's kind of the game that a lot of active Mormons play. I mean, I think there's a lot of active Mormons who are all in, entirely devoted throughout all of their doings and their day-to-day. But I also think there's a lot of people who it's kind of like a persona that they check into and then back out of. One way I've been seeing this lately is with the new garment update. So in case you missed it, the Mormon Church has now released garments that are tank tops. It's like a thick strap tank top, which is a really big deal. Many of us who grew up Mormon were told that it was inappropriate and immodest to show our shoulders. And a big part of that was because garments, which all worthy Mormons must wear after they're young adults and go through the temple, were cap sleeve. So you could not wear garments and also wear tank tops. But the church just changed that because they came out with tank top garments. As I've been witnessing Mormon women talking about this garment change and celebrating this garment change and the amount of excitement they have to finally be able to wear a tank top, it's made me realize how much they have been repressing themselves, but they haven't even been allowed to admit that. And then once the change happened, then they can say, oh my gosh, I'm so happy now that I finally get to wear a tank top, which just goes to show that this whole time they were dying to wear a tank top, but they weren't allowed to because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints hadn't yet said, okay, fine, we'll give a little, you can wear a tank top. And it feels very severance-y. It feels like before that change, you were probably making justifications for why it was cap sleeve. You were probably agreeing that shoulders can be immodest, but as soon as leadership, these people that you revere and worship and think are very close to God, until they say, actually, we changed our mind, then you're kind of able to admit like, oh, well, I actually never fully agreed with that thing anyway. Here's another listener submitted thought. At its core, severance is about compartmentalization taken to an extreme, literally splitting the self into two separate identities, the innie, work self, and the outie, outside world self. If you've ever been part of a high-demand religion, especially one like Mormonism, me, this probably feels eerily familiar. There's the version of you that operates within the structure, the believer, the good member, the one who follows the rules. And then there's the version of you outside of it, the one that might feel like a totally different person with different thoughts, desires, and freedoms. The show asks, what happens when those two selves start to question each other? And, well, ... ex-Mormon TikTok could answer that in about 1 million different videos. This got me thinking a lot about something that they call in the world of severance reintegration. Reintegration is the process of connecting the two separate personas, of connecting the innie and the outie, their memories and their personalities. And it's kind of vague and ambiguous so far, like how that would actually work. But I wrote down in my notes while watching, reintegration is when your Mormon self and your ex-Mormon self converge. I feel like reintegration is almost the process of healing, of not just leaving your church self completely behind and saying, that was a totally different person, but rather finding healthy ways to incorporate your church self into your life story, if that makes sense. Because I've struggled with this in a big way, being ex-Mormon, where I look back at myself as a Mormon and it really does sometimes feel like I'm not sure who that person was. I feel this most poignantly when I was a missionary. Like looking at myself as an active Mormon missionary, I'm like, where is Haley in there? Because as a missionary, you have to cut off even more of yourself because the rules are even stricter because you're separated from your family. It's actually a ton like Severance, a Mormon mission, because you're completely separated from your normal life. You're taken out of it. You are cut off from contact of your normal life. Yes, you can still remember it, but it feels very separate and like a distinct reality, especially because you go somewhere else, oftentimes somewhere foreign. And so it makes it feel like it almost didn't exist. Like when I think back on my mission, it almost feels like an alternate timeline. Like I just didn't live that part of my life like someone else did. Part of healing, I think, and reconstructing a life after Mormonism is realizing that was still me. And there was still so much of me there. It was still my personality. And I had these thoughts and these desires, but I was just actively trying to cut them off. So I think that just raises a lot of interesting questions and ideas about how to integrate who you were when you were a part of such a high demand religion or a cult. We're going to take a quick little break so I can tell you about one of my holy grail cannot live without products, Early Bird CBD gummies. These gummies contain a microdose of THC, so they have 2.5 milligrams of THC and 12.5 milligrams of CBD per gummy, which is a really magical ratio for how it makes you feel. I really enjoy using these to wind down at night. That's my preferred use. You can also use these if you're going to go do something fun outdoors, if you want to get into a creative workflow, if you want to pregame a little bit. I have gotten so many of my friends hooked onto Early Bird gummies, and I love spreading the gospel of Early Bird. The best part is that these are legal in all 50 states and you can get them delivered right to your door. I personally think this is the best place to start if you are cannabis curious, but they also work super well for a more seasoned cannabis user like myself. You can use the code GIRLSCAMP for 20% off at earlybirdcbd.com. That's code GIRLSCAMP for 20% off at earlybirdcbd.com. Enjoy. Now I'm going to read a Reddit post. Still talking about severance and the concept of severance generally, listen to this Reddit post. Multiple people have pointed out the cult undertones between Mormonism and severance, but one aspect I haven't seen discussed is the similarities between the severance procedure and the concept of the veil of forgetfulness in Mormonism. The idea that we are responsible for holding up agreements that another version of ourselves agreed to that we don't remember is inherently immoral. The show depicts these naive innies who have to live with the consequences of the actions of their outies. You see very quickly that when it comes to the challenges and pain of life, removing pain and memories has long-term negative consequences. In one scene, Helly is, what do you call, like, not the main character, but trying to think in the Oscar lingo, supporting actress. She's one of the main characters of the show, and Helly is the name of the innie. Helly is able to grow as a person by reclaiming her sexuality after feeling like she was wrongfully denied the experience of being with someone she had feelings for. As members, we all felt like, quote, the work is mysterious and important, and that we owed a debt to a person we had no memory of. The veil/severance is just a way for the church/lumen to control the narrative of our lives and, by extension, our behavior. This is so fascinating. Let me give you a little rundown, a little 101 on Mormon cosmology, on what the Mormons call the plan of salvation, so you know what the veil of forgetfulness is. Mormons believe that before humans were born into this world, that everybody lived as like spirit children in something called the premortal existence, or the pre-earth life is another word for it. There was a great council in heaven, as they also call it, where the plan of salvation was actually presented to, theoretically, if this were true, all of us. And we had the decision to opt in to this plan. And part of opting in was agreeing to the fact that we would go down to earth and we would not remember anything that we experienced in the pre-earth life. We would go down to earth and we would be tested, essentially, to see if we would do the right things, do the Mormon way, so that we could go back and be with God again. And some people in the pre-earth life, in the premortal existence, actually chose not to opt in to the plan. So they did not get the chance to come down to earth and get bodies and do the whole earth thing. And it was actually Satan he was the one who said, I don't like that plan. I don't think people should have free agency. I think they should all just be forced to do things the right way so that they all make it back. So the people who went with Satan didn't get bodies, and those are now like Satan and his minions, essentially. Nothing like trying to explain Mormon doctrine casually, because it just rings very, very funny when I'm trying to just like casually tell you about Satan and his minions and how they got there, according to the Mormons. Anyway, that veil of forgetfulness thing is so, so true, because if that were the case, that would mean that I, Haley Rawl, was up in heaven before this, and I said, yes, God, I commit to your plan. I'm going to go down there and do it the right way. And yes, you can make me forget. And then I was born and I did forget. And now I'm here and I am still being held essentially accountable for that decision that I made in a totally separate state of being. And that feels like the innie-outie divide. An outie made a decision, but then the innie is the one who suffers for the decision and is responsible and accountable for living out that decision, even though in that separate state of being, they aren't the ones who made that decision in the first place. There's another really interesting principle when we're thinking about the pre-earth life in Mormonism called foreordination, which basically means that there were people chosen in the pre-earth life to be extra special here on earth, like prophets, or they were going to be doing great things for God and building up the kingdom of God. And also in Mormonism, you get something called a patriarchal blessing, which is like a light fortune-telling blessing that kind of tells you like what's going to happen in your life. And there's a lot of language in those patriarchal blessings that will say things like, you were foreordained to be a leader. I'm pretty sure, I need to look at mine again, but I'm pretty sure mine says you will be a leader amongst, or like people will look to you because of your testimony, just things like that, which is also interesting to think about in relation to this accountability, responsibility thing. And with a church like Mormonism, that is so fixated in a big way on agency. That's a huge part of Mormonism, is that we have agency, we have choice. And they like to play up the agency part when they're talking about the pre-earth life, because oftentimes people who are arguing against religion will say, well, God just made me and put me here. I didn't have a decision to be here or not. Where Mormons would say, actually, you did have the decision, which is silly anyway, because it's like, well, I didn't have the decision to show up in the pre-earth life and have to make that decision. But also, I don't know that bitch who made that choice to come down to earth and agree to be Mormon. I don't know who that is because I forgot about it all. And it's also highly unethical in the case of Lumen and Severance that these innies would have to then live out something just because their outie made that decision. Let's talk about the next theme, which I am calling obedience and manufactured meaning. There was a quote in that last Reddit post that I read, which said, "The work is mysterious and important." That is something that the leaders at Lumen will tell the employees. The work is mysterious and important. Before we get into that a little bit more, that language felt really familiar to me. And I found this verse in the Doctrine and Covenants, which, if you don't know, the Doctrine and Covenants is an additional book of scripture to Mormons. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it says, "Wherefore, be not weary in well-doing, for ye are laying the foundation of a great work, and out of small things proceedeth that which is great." Those just felt so reminiscent of each other, talking about this important, great work, but not really saying what that work is. Just like a very impractical, kind of lofty thing to say to someone of like, we don't know exactly how, but there is this great work, and you are an important part of it. Mormonism and other high-demand religions make you feel like your efforts are really crucial, even if they're completely nonsensical or even if they don't make complete sense to you. So in the case of Severance, the employees actually don't know what the work is. It's a very strange type of work and they don't understand like why they're doing it. In Mormonism, it's not quite so opaque. However, I do feel like there's a lot of work for work's sake. Like Mormons just think that it's a really good thing to be busying yourself with like the Lord's work. But in reality, oftentimes that's doing things like throwing an activity that nobody wants to go to anyway. I remember always thinking that, especially as an adult, I would feel a lot of pressure to go to like a Relief Society activity because I wanted the women who plan that activity to have people come. Like I felt bad that they had taken so much time and energy to plan this whole activity. So I felt pressure to go, but it was like, well, what if we just didn't do this activity? And then no one feels pressure to plan it. And then no one feels pressure to go. Like it's very work for work's sake and just like trying to get people in the church building and trying to, in my opinion now in retrospect, take up more of their lives. And obviously there's community building. There's things about that I think can be positive, but I think that the church takes it to such an extreme with so many activities, particularly for youth, that it ends up being work that you feel like is so important when in reality, it's kind of just like taking a lot of time out of your life and the people's lives who are like coming to these activities and lessons and things like that. What this called to mind most specifically for me, though, was the Mormon temple ritual, the endowment session, and I guess all the things that go on in the temple, because Mormons call going to the temple work, because you go to the temple and one time you do the rituals yourself. If you're curious about what those rituals are, I'll link an episode where I get into all of that. But there's one time where you go and do that for yourself. And then every time you go back to the temple, so anytime, almost anytime a Mormon is like, I went to the temple today, they are going to do work on behalf of people who have died, like by proxy. And the thing is with the temple is something that even very active, devout Mormons will tell you, I don't completely understand everything that happens in the temple, or it'll take your life to understand what's going on there. You have to go many times to start to make sense of it, to start to understand completely what's going on. It's a mysterious and important work, is very much what it feels like. And it actually feels like, because it's mysterious, in some ways that makes it more important. Like the mystery of it all is kind of used to be like, this is something we don't fully understand, which must mean it's extra important. When if you're using your more rational brain, you would just be like, why am I going to this building and doing these rituals that I don't understand, that maybe make you uncomfortable or are confusing? You probably wouldn't be opting into that unless you had all of this messaging that it was so important to do. I'm going to read another listener submission here. I actually think a lot of these listener submissions I'm reading, someone wrote like a multi-paragraph submission that was just so good. Thank you. I think this might be from that same submission. If you want to DM me who you are, I would love to credit you because your thoughts were very useful for me in thinking through all of this. Okay, they say, one of the most chilling aspects of severance is how the employees justify their suffering. The work itself is seemingly meaningless, literally just sorting numbers based on how they feel, but they convince themselves it matters because the alternative, realizing they're trapped, is unbearable. Does this sound familiar? In high-demand religions, the emphasis on obedience over personal intuition keeps people from questioning the logic of the system. You feel like you're doing something important because you're constantly told you are. That is why deconstruction or reintegration, which we were just talking about when you put the two halves together, is so unbelievably painful. Reconciling your false beliefs with reality is extremely difficult and genuinely makes you ill for some time. So much good stuff in there. But the thing I want to highlight is the justification of suffering. I knew well before I left the Mormon church that Mormonism had a martyr problem. If there is one thing that I think Mormonism really instills in you, it is that it is noble and even holy and sacred to be a martyr. Whether that is on the level of the founding prophet Joseph Smith, who actually was martyred for Mormonism, who actually was killed, or all the way down to women, you should be mothers and give your whole selves and your whole identities to raising children. I've seen this play out in countless ways myself as a Mormon, like I was talking about on my mission with Mormons around me. I think it can be really dangerous to teach people that suffering for the cause is going to ultimately be the best thing that they can do. And obviously, there's a lot we could talk about with suffering. I think suffering is a part of life. If you're looking at it from more of an Eastern philosophy lens, like suffering is part of this. So I'm not saying suffering is inherently bad, but I do think if you're primed to think, oh, if I'm suffering, that's a good thing, I do think that's bad. And I felt this on my mission all the time. I would be suffering in a really significant way. Like my body, my brain, my mental health was terrible. I was not doing well. And rather than get myself out of that situation, I would convince myself, actually, I'm supposed to be suffering. And the whole point of this is to suffer. And I'm suffering for God. And I'm suffering for the cause of moving Mormonism forward. And when we're talking about lack of meaning in work, a mission also comes to mind because you're going door to door, stopping people, so many people all the time, and no one is converting to the church, at least in Berlin, Germany. It's not working. It feels meaningless because it's not getting you anywhere, but you are told that the work itself is the meaning, and actually the more suffering it causes you, the better you're probably doing. It is such a mindfuck. Nothing like talking about my mission to get me a little riled up. Severance brought up a ton of mission stuff for me. I want to highlight a couple super specific moments now that were so temple coded while we're talking about the temple stuff. Yeah, this is a light spoiler alert, although I don't think this is going to really affect much about the plot. I don't know. Skip ahead a couple minutes if you want to. Okay, so the first moment that felt very temple coded, there's a scene where Mr. Milchick, who is a Lumen employee, he's in charge of the severed floor of the innies, he gets in trouble. And he's looking in the mirror and he's reading, kind of chanting, almost like coaching himself. And he says, "You must eradicate from yourself childish folly." That sounded very familiar to me. In the temple, it's not necessarily a chant, but there are things that you repeat. It's like a script, and you are making promises and repeating these words. And one of those is avoid all loud laughter, light-mindedness, and evil speaking of the Lord's anointed. Something about childish folly felt like you could just like slip that right in, like between loud laughter and light-mindedness. It just is one of those phrases too, where it's like, but what does that really mean though? Like when you're in the temple saying you'll avoid light-mindedness, what does that really mean? And I think when Lumen, in the case of Severance, or Mormonism, when they use this really high, lofty language, it gets confusing because it's not very practical. Like you don't know what you're actually saying. And that Mr. Milchick moment felt very temple coded. This next moment was in the final episode of season 2. I am not exaggerating. I gasped loudly, paused it, and we had to go back and watch it twice because this moment almost has me convinced that someone in the writer's room was actually looking at what happens in the Mormon temple because it felt that similar. I also wanted to say at the beginning of the episode, but better late than never, Dan Erickson, he is the creator of the show. So he came up with the idea and he's the main writer. I've seen chatter on the internet suggesting that he possibly could have been raised Mormon. However, I couldn't find anything definitive. And I feel like if he was, there probably would be something definitive. So I don't know. He probably wasn't raised Mormon, but I do wonder how much they kind of looked at Mormonism as a reference point. I know there's tons of similarities in the series to Scientology as well. I haven't gone down that particular rabbit hole, but I'm curious how much of this is just because they're talking about a cult, basically, so it is reminiscent of the Mormon cult, or if there was actual like consultation to Mormonism. Okay, I'm going to read the dialogue that happens in this moment, and then I'll read what happens in the temple. There's a woman named Lorne. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce her name. She is kind of a very side character. Anyway, she comes up to this man who's also wearing a suit and tie. His name is Mr. Drummond. And she says, "Mammalian's nurturable brings an offering. Has it verve?" asks Mr. Drummond. "It does. Wiles the most of its flock. This beast will be entombed with a cherished woman whose spirit it must guide to Kier's door. Is it up to the task? It is." In the temple, towards the end of the endowment ceremony, as it's called, you walk up to something that is supposed to simulate a veil. So it's like a white curtain, and you actually knock, and there's someone on the other side of the veil, and you have this dialogue with the person. Also, the person on the other side is pretending to be Jesus, and you actually reach through the curtain and do like specific hand things, like hand signals, I guess, where you're like touching the other person's hand in a specific way. And the person on the other side asks, "What is that?" "The first token of the Aaronic priesthood. Has it a name?" "It has." "Will you give it to me?" "I will, through the veil." The cadence is crazy similar. When Mr. Drummond says, "Has it verve?" and Lorne responded, "It does," I was so shocked that she didn't say "it has," because it's so close. Like, has it a name? It has. Will you give it to me? I will, through the veil. It's just crazy similar. I know so many of us jumped out of our chairs when we came to that part, and I kind of just can't get over how similar it was. Not to mention, the whole setting felt very much like a temple. All of the severed floor feels like a Mormon temple meets a corporate office. It's white. It's very bright, which a Mormon temple is. White, way too bright. Everyone's in like similar clothing. In the Mormon temple, they're all wearing white. It's very quiet and like kind of empty. Just the vibe felt very similar to my experience in the Mormon temple. Also, because Lorne is like giving a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, which doesn't happen in the Mormon temple, although many of us thought that it would because it's very secret what happens in the Mormon temple, but it feels reminiscent because the Mormon temple also has an altar. There were also certain like hand movements in that final episode that felt similar to what you do in the temple. There's one hand movement you do where you raise your arm to the square, like put your arm in a 90-degree angle. And I swear Mr. Drummond did that with the sheep, like during that sequence. And there was another part where there's a robotic Kier, if you know, you know. And a lot of people have pointed out that a lot of his hand signals felt very temple coded too. Moving on from the temple, the next theme we're going to talk about is leadership and idolizing leaders. Here's another post from Reddit that I pulled. I know this show is about work-life balance, but as someone who recently left a very strict religion, it hit home for me. I grew up Mormon and went on a mission and everything. There are so many parallels between the way Kier is idolized and quoted in the show and Joseph Smith or Brigham Young in Mormonism. There are whole books of scriptures and rules just like the handbook at Lumen. Just like Irving quoting Kier to reprimand his coworkers, you are trained to call people out by quoting prophets. Just like how Kier's house is preserved, there's a house devoted to Brigham Young called the Beehive House. Kier is the founder of Lumen. So he's the one who started the whole thing. And they even say things like praise Kier. Like he's the prophet, essentially. They don't call him that. It's more founder vibes, but it's very also prophet vibes. So let's break down the similarities this person pointed out. In Severance, Lumen has something called the Perpetuity Wing, and it's a place that like they kind of go on a field trip. And in that wing, there is a replica of Kier's home. And they go and like check out what Kier's home looked like. In Salt Lake City, there is a place called the Beehive House. This is where Brigham Young, Lorenzo Snow, and Joseph F. Smith. So Brigham Young was the second prophet of the church, and those other two are the third and fourth. They lived in that home. The home has actually been restored to its 19th century appearance and is open for tours. Even currently, you could go take a tour of the Beehive House. Very similar vibes to taking a tour of Kier's house. Another similarity mentioned here is the Lumen Handbook. So in the Severance world, there's a handbook called the Compliance Handbook, and it has 1 volume and 4 appendices. And it actually physically looks like a book of scripture, like it looks like a Bible or a Book of Mormon, and it's basically the end-all be-all. It's like scripture for the people at Lumen. In the same way that Mormons have not only scriptures, but also the church handbook, which is treated like scripture. There's also a ton of similarities in the artwork that you see at Lumen and Mormon artwork. A listener said, "This one is kind of niche, but the artwork. Something about all of the paintings we see in the halls reminds me so much of art I'd see walking around a church building or a temple. And I know a lot of religious/biblical artwork looks similar, but something about the art in Severance feels so distinctly Mormon to me, and I can't put my finger on why." Let me help you put your finger on it, because there are really striking similarities between even particular works of art. I'm going to shout out at Storyteller Sid here. She is on TikTok, and I'll link this particular TikTok. She's also done some other Severance Mormonism TikToks that are really interesting, but she does a TikTok, and this is what she points out. There are wax figures on display of Kier at Lumen, as well as the successors of Kier. You can also find wax figures of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young on display at the Visitor Center in Salt Lake City. There's a painted portrait of Kier Egan, which looks a lot like portraits of Mormon prophets. There's also a painting of Kier in military garb, and there's a very similar painting to Joseph Smith in military garb. The one that's probably most striking is there is a painting called The Youthful Convalescence of Kier, and it shows Kier as a young boy, and he's in bed looking sick, and he's surrounded by like multiple older figures. And there's a painting of Joseph Smith sick in bed as a young boy, also surrounded by multiple adult figures. And that painting tells the story of Joseph Smith when he got sick with typhoid fever and he got a really bad infection in his leg. those two paintings, like the composition and everything, actually looks incredibly similar. Sid says this at the end of that TikTok. She mentions that cameras were already invented both when Lumen was founded, because Lumen was founded in 1865, and when Mormonism was founded. But choosing to commission artwork further romanticizes and mythologizes the history and doctrine of both Lumen and the Mormon Church. That was really interesting to think about, because there was this whole thing where I'm pretty sure they found a photograph, an actual photograph of Joseph Smith. I don't know if it's been like 100% verified that it was him, but it's interesting to think about how there could be a photo of Joseph Smith, but so much of what I know of Joseph Smith, even when I close my eyes and picture Joseph Smith, it's through artwork, and how that does have a lot of power, to Sid's point, to mythologize people when it is through art rather than just through actual photographs. There was a Reddit comment that I also pulled, and it says, "It doesn't surprise me that it hit home for you. Eganism," so they're talking about Kier Egan, the last name is Egan, so they're basically talking about the Lumen cult, "has a strong thematic resemblance to Mormonism. It's a newer ideology with a bizarre lore and a kind of Wild West vibe / aesthetic." I thought that was really interesting to think about too. The artwork at Lumen probably feels very reminiscent to Mormonism because it was founded around the same time. So it's also harkening back to like a very similar time period. And there's not a lot of, to the original listener's point, there's not a lot of artwork that is religious that is that new. Because yes, there's biblical artwork, but seeing that artwork kind of not recreated, but seeing those same types of compositions and things used, but in the 1800s feels very different, and it feels very Mormon. The next theme I want to talk about is the fear of leaving. A listener submitted this. "Mark has a tragic reason for opting into severance, but once inside, his innie doesn't know that. He's just there. The idea of leaving is terrifying because he's been conditioned to believe the outside world is scary, unknown, wrong. High-demand religions do this too. Paint life outside the faith as dark, lonely, and miserable. When you've spent your whole life inside a system like that, walking away can feel like erasing yourself. The innies only know their life at Lumen, therefore it is their only existence. Innies do not exist outside of the severed floor." This really hit home for me because it portrays why leaving Mormonism is so intense, because it's not just emotional, it's existential. And it's not even just existential in the way of, well, now I don't know what happens after this. Now I don't know the meaning and purpose of life. It is existential to your identity. You don't know who you are without it. You don't know if your identity will survive without it. It does feel like almost killing a part of yourself in this way. And that's not even to mention, of course, that religions like Mormonism, which Lumen also does this, as do many religions, they tell you that everything outside of the religion is scary and dark and evil and wrong, and that all happiness and joy exists within that religion. And so really making the decision to leave it is incredibly scary when you have been told your whole existence that this is the thing that's keeping you safe and keeping you happy. And it's also a huge mindfuck when you don't feel safe and happy, but you're being told again and again, this is where you have to stay to be safe and happy. And then obviously when you put that on the any outie level, if the outie doesn't let their innie go back to work, that is essentially killing off an entire persona. So it's interesting to think about that difference too with severance as compared to Mormonism, because I guess the only way that the severance world kind of allows for this is with reintegration, because leaving the Mormon church, it's not like you are entirely killing off a whole persona, because you can move forward with those memories. So it does feel less like killing the innie to me personally, and more like reintegration, which still feels in some ways like killing the innie, because with reintegration, it's like, well, how much does that innie even come into play anymore? Because they were only existing at work, and this outie has this whole other life and people and all of those things. So it's really interesting to think about those differences too. Now I'm just going to run through a list of some other observations that didn't fit in a particular bucket, but I think are very much still worth discussing. Number 1, Dylan. This is a spoiler, so skip ahead a minute. Dylan meeting with his wife. So in the second season, when they let Dylan meet his outie wife, the first time they met, it reminded me so much of calling home from your mission on Mother's Day and Christmas, because you feel like a different person and all your family is just like still the same. And it's so awkward and strange. And you feel like this desperate neediness, but they're just like living their lives. And you're the one who's like isolated and in this weird reality. It just felt very much like my calls home felt when I was on my mission. Purity culture. I was thinking about purity culture because, without spoiling anything, I guess this is a light spoiler, but when certain innies have sex, I looked over to Bentley and I was like, that changes everything, because now they have a taste of this really life-affirming thing that they know they're missing out on. Before, they didn't know. And I was thinking about that with purity culture and how if you can keep people from having sex, for example, the organization is going to be much better off if people never have sex. Because once you have a taste of something like sex, you're like, that's really great. And that's not evil. And that's not bad. And then I think you become more difficult to control around sex, but also around a lot of other things. So it was interesting to see, especially in the second season, the innies kind of having more and more tastes of life outside, and how much that just affected the way that they then viewed the box that they were inside of. And I think purity culture is very much that way. Here's a listener submission, and this is season 2 stuff. The dinner scene between Irving, Bert, and Fields told us so much about how Lumen weaponizes religion to convince people to get severed. Bert talks about how he had done terrible things in the past, and Lumen essentially manipulated him into believing that if he got severed, his innie would be saved because innies are pure and clean. This feels like a direct commentary on religions that sever your identity / create a new identity under the umbrella of their organization, and they tell you the only way to be saved is under their roof / control. 100%. That might have been, besides the final episode, one of my favorite episodes of the second season was when we got more backstory on Bert, who worked also at Lumen. He worked in a different department, so we kind of got glimpses of him in the first season, and then at the end of the first season, he retires, so his innie is never going back to work. So then we get to meet Bert on the outside, and we learn that his motivation for severance was because he met this man and he wanted to be with this man. He also wanted to be with this man in heaven, but he had done some really bad sins. And so he was told, well, you get a second chance if you create an innie. The innie will actually be judged completely separately from the outie. So you could go to heaven as Bert, but as innie Bert. That whole thing reminded me a little bit of baptism for the dead, where in Mormonism, like I was talking about with the temple, you can go and get baptized for people who have already died, which would give them the chance to, after death, accept Mormonism and then like go to the highest degree of heaven. It feels kind of like that, like this weird second chance, but again, in an alternate state of being, because wouldn't you be so much more likely to accept Mormonism after death when you realize that Mormonism is true than on earth? So it's like an altered state of being. You get the chance to be innocent. I also think it just raised a lot of really interesting questions around the idea of repentance. Like, okay, outie Bert did things that he can never recover from, but then if he just severs part of himself, then he can be completely innocent again. But that doesn't mean that the impact of his decisions as outie Bert are just taken away. Just this kind of faux sense of relief from responsibility that I think repentance can be, where it's like, no matter if you repent from something or not, that doesn't mean that that thing wasn't done and that it had its impacts. And I don't mean to say people can't change and grow. I think the idea of repentance in a way is really beautiful, but I think thinking that you can just go pray for a sin to be gone and then some magical process happens that makes you innocent is strange and feels like what Bert was trying to do. It was also really interesting to get more insight onto the outside world because we don't get a ton of that in Severance. We do here and there, but thinking about the ethical dilemmas this would be raising in society if Severance could actually happen, and how that would also affect religion and how religions would have to start weighing in on things like, does an innie have a soul that will be judged separately? So that was just kind of fun to think about. Next thought, racism. Shout out to this podcast. It's called the Crazy Stupid Podcast, and they will be in the show notes. I watched this whole video and kind of skimmed through a couple of their other videos on Severance. So good. I loved their commentary, but they delve a lot into the racism that happens at Lumen. Mr. Milchick, the one in charge of the severed floor, he's Black. There's another character who's Black, and there's some really interesting, really heartbreaking moments where we see racism and we see Mr. Milchick kind of trying to reconcile being a Black man in this very, very white organization. I can't speak to that, of course, from my own personal experience, but I know speaking with a number of Black people who left Mormonism that would probably feel quite resonant. I'm not going to get so into that, but please go watch that video in the show notes because it does a really good job of breaking all of that down. Here's another listener submitted thought. Questions about technology crop up every time people try to decipher the show's timestamp. The fact that we've seen a smartphone gives us a particular time horizon that makes Lumen's use of outdated technology seem absurd. They have an advanced chip that can sever a human brain, but they're also using personal audio cassette players, outdated computer terminals, a speakerphone for the board, not to mention a whole parking lot full of old cars. Why? We could chalk it all up to a fun quirk of the show that the creators and set designers want us to feel a little disoriented and out of place, which would be reason enough. But I think there's more to it. Lumen isn't just a corporation, but more of a new religious movement. Many religious movements have a tendency to sanctify mundane aspects of the world and then stay locked on them. This is especially obvious with groups like the Amish who refuse more advanced technologies, but it also happens in Mormonism. I served a mission in the early 2000s, and despite the fact that email had been around for a while, we were still using fax machines to update our mission president about our numbers. The closer you got to central administrative power, the better tech became. They had computers at the main mission office, of course. This arrangement had the benefit of keeping computers out of the hands of young 19-year-old boys and 21-year-old girls, not just because of porn, but also because it helped control access to broader information in general. And it all seemed exactly right to me from the inside. This was the way God intended it to be. Mormonism has been locked into a sort of 1950s conservative aesthetic since the 50s. Missionaries with regulated hairstyles, no facial hair, wearing white shirts and conservative suits. Even some of the office space of Lumen reminds me of the corporate aesthetic many Mormon church buildings got locked into in that era. This is actually, they included their handle at Relationscapes. Shout out to them. I will also link them in the show notes. This is something a lot of people have talked about with this series because it's a little bit lost in time because the technology of Lumen is so outdated. But then again, there's Severance, which kind of gives this dystopian feel. It does feel very disorienting, as this person pointed out. But wow, I never made the connection to outdated technology in Mormonism. When you think about walking into a Mormon library, so every church building has a library where you can check out like different manuals and things like that. I don't know, I haven't been for 5 years, but even 5 years ago, they had projectors in there. Like you could rent a projector or like a really old TV that you like roll away on this rolling cart. Like it's just very, very outdated, which is really interesting, especially for such a, like, we are modern religion. And yes, on my mission, so I went on my mission in 2015, we had a brick phone. I remember being very embarrassed walking around with that brick phone. We could only email and Skype home twice a year, where, you know, we had access to, we could have been texting, like we could have stayed in better contact, but It's a means of control if you can control information and how people can access communication the way that they do inside of Lumen. Very, very interesting. The last thing I'll say, I promise this is the last thing I'll say, but I think it's very worth mentioning. Lumen is a corporation, and a lot of people originally saw the show as a commentary on work-life balance and how people end up sort of worshiping corporations and how corporations steal so much of your lives and your time, et cetera, et cetera. I still think that that's very much the case, but I think another reason that it felt so similar to Mormonism is because Mormonism is such a corporate religion. It's so businessy. It's so much more businessy, I think, than most religions. And because Mormonism is really teetering between mainstream religion and cult, the business side of it makes it more interesting because there are a lot of cults that are, MLMs even, that are very culty. So it's like the business cult side of it, but Mormonism has like the religious side that feels more traditional religion while also having this business side. Because Mormonism has so much money, because we know the Mormon church has so much money, just the whole aesthetic, the way that the leaders dress, the way that the missionaries dress, it does feel very corporate. When a lot of times if you're thinking about religion, it feels a little bit more free-spirited. I don't know, like I'm thinking of the Pope and what the Pope wears, or Catholic priests wearing robes, or in Buddhism, if you're watching White Lotus, I wanted to say Buddhism the way Parker Posey's character says it. Buddhism. If you know, you know. But Buddhists will wear robes or tunics, whereas Mormons, it's very clean cut. It feels just more corporate. And so I think that's another reason those aesthetics feel eerily familiar, is seeing something religious, but in a corporate way. I feel like I could talk forever about this. There's honestly so much more we didn't even dive into. So please let me know if you're watching on YouTube in the comments, DM me. I am just endlessly fascinated by the series. It has been confirmed that we're getting a season 3, and I can't wait to see where things go. I really can't. I know there's mixed opinions on the ending of season 2. I personally really, really loved it. I think that final episode was just absolutely remarkable. I'm making dad jokes and puns now, so I'm gonna go, but thank you so much for listening. It would mean so much to me if you could like, subscribe, leave a review. It's really simple to do and makes a big difference. So if you found this interesting in any way, please do that. You can follow along on Instagram at Girls Camp Podcast, YouTube Girls Camp Podcast, TikTok Haley Rawl. Would love to see you there and can't wait to hear your thoughts. Talk soon. Bye.